it feels like if you get one bad grade that you won't become a doctor. An NYU organic chemistry professor was just dismissed after many students were failing his class and ultimately signed a petition against him. Was this the student's fault, the professor's fault, or somewhere in between? That's what we're going to break down in this video. So it looks here, the New York Times, and this story has been blowing up lately, just commented on Dr. Maitland Jones Jr., who was a respected organic chemistry professor. Now he, it seems like, has written some of the textbooks in organic chemistry, multiple editions, and was a previously well-respected organic chemistry professor. So let's take a look at this article and see what's actually going on. So in the article, it states, in the field of organic chemistry, Maitland Jones Jr. has a storied reputation. He taught the subject for decades, first at Princeton and then at NYU, and wrote an influential textbook. He received awards for his teachings, as well as recognition as one of NYU's coolest professors. But last spring, as the campus emerged from pandemic restrictions, 82 of his 350 students signed a petition against him. Students said the high-stakes course, notorious for ending many a dream of medical school, was too hard, blaming Dr. Jones for their poor test scores. Okay, so as someone who has coached many pre-med students and has been a pre-med myself, it was always well known that organic chemistry is one of the hardest, what we call weed out classes for pre-med students. Here's the problem, and I believe this too when I was a pre-med myself. The system is set up where there's so much pressure, it feels like if you get one bad grade that you won't become a doctor. And this could not be further from the truth. I've personally worked with many students who had absolutely horrible freshman, sophomore year grades, even had a bad grade or two in their later years, and were still able to get into medical school. So just because you had a D or a C in this Orgo class, let's say, it does not mean, and even an F, it doesn't mean you can't be a doctor. Some people will actually drop out just because they got one bad grade. And there's so many people that probably could have been doctors that let their dream just die too early. And it's very unfortunate to see. It's one of the reasons I started the Premed Consultants coaching program, and is ultimately something we need to fix within the pre-med world, is understanding that you can still get into medical school and become a doctor even if you don't have perfect grades. You had a bad couple of classes or even semesters. There's a lot of students that do a post-bac program. That means they take classes after undergrad so that they can improve their overall GPA and then ultimately get into medical school. So this is actually very common and sometimes very misunderstood, especially when you're just starting out as a pre-med. So that has nothing to do with whether or not this professor was fair, but either way, let's say you took his class and you did poorly, you shouldn't let that scare you away from continuing to achieve your dream of becoming a doctor. Because the reality is, I promise, even if you were not the best organic chemistry student, you could still become an amazing physician. And on a day-to-day, you're really not using organic chemistry a lot. Now, is it important? It's helpful, especially as a basis to then biochemistry, which is more helpful as a future physician and when you're going to be taking the boards in medical school. But do you need to know everything about Orgo? Not really. And whether it should be a prereq at all is something we could be debating forever, and I know a lot of students are very heavily against it, but it does require you to have critical thinking skills, be able to make decisions, and is less likely to rely on just rote memory. And so there are advantages to it as a course, but it can seem unfair sometimes when you're studying really hard and you're not getting near the grades you feel like you deserve. So let's take a look more at what happened here. The article goes on to state, the professor defends his standards, but just before the start of the fall semester, university deans terminated Dr. Jones' contract. The officials also had tried to placate the students by offering to review their grades and allowing them to withdraw from the class retroactively. Now, if you do withdraw from a class, a lot of times it will still have a withdrawal on your transcript, which does go to the medical school. So they will see that and be curious as to what happened. And it doesn't mean you can't have a good explanation for it, but that is something to note. If you withdraw from a class, or even if you retake a class and let's say you got a C the first time and an A the second time, a lot of people think because your school will replace the grade, that's how it works for medical school. But actually, on medical school applications, you need to put both grades in the application, the C and the A. The chemistry department's chair, Mark E. Tuckerman, said the unusual offer to withdraw was a one-time exception granted to students by the dean of the college. Mark A. Walters, director of undergrad studies in the chemistry department, summed up the situation in an email to Dr. Jones before his firing. He said the plan would extend a gentle but firm hand to the students and those who pay the tuition bills, and apparent reference to parents. The university's handling of the petition provoked equal and opposite reactions from both the chemistry faculty who protested the decisions and pro-Jones students who sent glowing letters of endorsement. So it does seem like some students definitely liked this professor as well. The deans are obviously going for some bottom line, and they want happy students who are saying great things about the university, so more people apply and the U.S. News rankings keep going higher, said Paramjit Arora, a chemistry professor who has worked closely with Dr. Jones. Yeah, this is true. A lot of schools are very scared of their U.S. News rankings dropping because that brings in more applications, more money to the schools. And this is in the medical world as well. These U.S. News rankings are like the gospel, and people will do things just to improve their overall rankings. And it's sometimes unclear how these rankings are even made. It doesn't mean that if you go to a school that's not at the top of the U.S. News ranking list that you're not getting an amazing education, because honestly what I've noticed too is it's very professor dependent in regards to how well that class is taught. However, that's not an excuse for not doing well in class. I tell students all the time, go in expecting your professors are not going to be good and that you're going to need to self-study the material so that you can do well. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be good professors. Hopefully they can enhance your learning, but not every professor is going to be the same. And so you might have a small community college that has a better professor at one of these big universities. A lot of times also some of these bigger professors, they're really well known in the field, they're well researched, but that doesn't always translate to being an amazing teacher. However, sometimes it does. In short, this one unhappy chemistry class could be the case study of the pressures of higher education as it tries to handle its Gen Z student body. Should universities ease pressure on students, many of whom are still coping with the pandemic's effects of their mental health and schooling? How should universities respond to the increasing number of complaints by students against professors? Do students have too much power over contract faculty members who do not have the protections of tenure? Yeah, that's a good point. I'm guessing this professor, it was not tenured for some reason because it's usually extremely difficult to fire a tenured professor. So the fact that they were able to do this because of just a lot of student complaints, especially someone who's been teaching there for multiple years, is a little bit odd to me. And with that said, I don't know what actually went on in the class, and it says, I think later on, that he was rude to many students, but then there's others that are supporting how he was as a professor. So you'll never know. I will say, having coached a lot of students, it's very clear to see which students are going to succeed in life and their career aspirations and which are not. And the ones that do not make excuses, put in hard work, and continue to persevere even when obstacles come up, those are the students that make it through, even if they didn't always have the best grade. We definitely have somewhat of a soft culture, I think, these days, and this is not for everyone. I'm not saying that everyone is like this, but there is, I have seen a more tendency to be able to complain and then get a reaction and response, and I don't necessarily know that is a good thing all the time. Now, if a professor was being abusive towards the students, really engaging in unfair behaviors, it isn't fair to put a bad grade on that student's transcript who did everything they could, and maybe in another comparable class with a professor that didn't have tests that had nothing to do with the material they were teaching, etc., and they were able to do well, then maybe it is worth looking more into that specific professor. But I've got to be honest, this is at every school. I went to Cornell. I absolutely loved it. There was always those notoriously hard professors, and yeah, you had to be in the really top percentages of your class to be the one getting the A. But the problem is, I think a lot of students don't realize that you don't need to get an A in every single class to get into medical school. Yes, you have to have good grades, and it is important over the long run. So if every NYU class was extremely hard to the point that you could never get above, let's say nobody, like say only a couple people in the whole class got a B or above, yeah, that's a big problem. But that's generally not going to be the case at most schools. All right, back to the article. And how hard should organic chemistry be anyway? Dr. Jones, 84, is known for changing the way the subject is taught. In addition to writing a 1,300-page textbook, Organic Chemistry, now in its 5th edition, he pioneered a new method of instruction that relied less on rote memorization and more on problem solving. So I'd be curious to know exactly what that method is. It's very hard to teach students abstract problem solving and is a good skill to have. I think that organic chemistry in some aspects does a good job of this. However, in other aspects, it makes it where you can go to the test and it's extremely hard to prepare for, and so you're at risk of getting these terrible scores because it's not like you could just study the material and know you're going to do well. So if you're not able to adapt to that type of abstract thinking and properly prepare for the test, it leads to a lot of low scores. After retiring from Princeton in 2007, he taught organic chemistry at NYU on a series of yearly contracts. About a decade ago, he said in an interview, he noticed a loss of focus among the students, even as more of them enrolled in his classes, hoping to pursue medical careers. Yeah, so focus is definitely a major issue. I think it's been a major issue for students for years to come. What I tell students is you need to set up your environment for success when you're studying, because if not, there's too many distractions. Your phone, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, like friends coming and bothering you while you're studying. It's really very difficult to get good focused studying done fun, and it's a skill that you actually need to practice. So what I do, even personally, because I'll get distracted by a phone as well. I teach students about studying. I did very well in university, and still I'll get easily distracted. So I have to, if I want to take studying seriously, set up my environment for success. So that means my phone goes in another room and it's probably turned off. And I also have usually an application on my computer where I can put in what websites I want blacklisted. And so I cannot access those websites for a certain amount of time. And these programs, I could link it below. If you want, let me know in the comments. They'll literally make it so you cannot go on Facebook. You can't go on YouTube. Even if you restart your computer, it's impossible. And so you'll notice the first couple times you do this and you study this way, you're going to have a compulsion to go to Facebook or to some sort of website. You're going to try, it's going to block out the screen. And then there's only one thing to do, and that's get back to studying. And so it really is a skill you have to practice. And the more you do it, the better you'll get. And then you can start to get into this flow state of studying where you're really being productive. Most students, 2 to 3 hours of that type of studying is better than 8 hours of studying at the library with friends, distracting, have different browser tabs open, and you're really not getting much work done throughout the day, even though it feels like you are. All right, it seems like he goes on to state, students were misreading exam questions at an astonishing rate. He wrote in a grievance to the university protesting his termination. Grades fell even as he reduced the difficulty of his exams. The problem was exacerbated by the pandemic, he said. In the last 2 years, they fell off a cliff, he wrote. We now see single digit and even zeros. So I'm not really sure how you could have a test that is a 0. I'm guessing that these are not multiple choice tests, because if they were, even statistically, you'd be able to, let's say, guess 1 out of every 4, 1 out of every 5. So my guess is it's orgo, reaction problems, you have to be showing your work, etc. I'm not sure how harshly they're grading, even if someone's attempting to show their work and does not get the right answer. I mean, I would assume that would give them some points. Really, the only way you should get a 0 is if you don't take the exam at all. But I have seen it's been very difficult for students during the pandemic to stay focused and study at home in an online environment. So again, that's where really learning and honing your own study skills becomes so important. You need to be able to block out distractions and really get good focused work done during periods of time. However, if these same students are doing well in all their classes except this one organic chemistry class, my guess is it is a very challenging class. I'd be curious to know what the average of that class actually is. Now, does that mean the professor should be fired? I don't necessarily think so, but it does feel like, and I've been there as a pre-med student, if you're usually doing so well in this one class, no matter how hard you work, you cannot excel on, it does feel a little bit hopeless at times. So I do empathize in that case. Now, would I personally write a petition? I don't know. Usually I try to just roll with the punches, but I do get how it could feel like your dreams are just slipping away. However, again, that's not the case. You can do bad in a couple classes and get into medical school, I promise. To ease stress, Dr. Jones and 2 other professors taped 52 organic chemistry lectures. Dr. Jones said that he personally paid more than $5,000 for the videos and that they are still used by the university. So that's nice. That's definitely something trying to make the online learning a little bit easier. That was not enough. In 2020, some 30 out of 475 students filed a petition asking for more help, and Dr. Aurora, who taught that class with Dr. Jones, said they were really struggling, he explained. Quote, they didn't have good internet coverage at home, all sorts of things. I can't tell if there's like a sarcastic undertone here that he was saying like people were making excuses or people were actually saying that they didn't have good internet at home. I'm assuming this is alluding to the class was taking place during the COVID era. The professor assuaged the students in an online town hall meeting. Dr. Aurora said many students were having other problems. Ken Kirschbaum, another chemistry professor at NYU, said he discovered cheating during online tests. Well, that's not okay. When he pushed students' grades down, noting the egregious misconduct, he said they protested that, quote, they were not given grades that would allow them to get into medical school. Again, if it always feels like the end of the world, it's not if you get one bad grade. I'm not saying you should strive for any bad grades. Like, you should strive to do your absolute best, but that doesn't mean you should be resorting to cheating. That's for sure. By spring 2022, the university was returning with fewer COVID restrictions, but the anxiety continued and students seemed disengaged. They weren't coming to class, that's for sure, because I can count the house, Dr. Jones said in an interview. They weren't watching the videos and they weren't able to answer the questions. Maybe I'll make a video another time about actually attending lectures, because you don't always have to attend the lectures in person to do well if they're recorded. I do find benefit sometimes to watching at your own pace, whether that's you speed it up or slow it down or pause at areas where you feel confused. Having a recording of something is helpful. So not going to lecture, I don't necessarily think would strictly correlate with poorer grades, but not studying as hard, or if they're not watching the recordings at all or the content they need to be studying for a class, that will definitely affect it. Students could choose between 2 sections, one focused on problem solving, the other on traditional lectures. Students in both sections shared problems on a GroupMe chat and began venting about the class. Those texts kickstarted the petition submitted in May. We are very concerned about our scores and find that they are not an accurate reflection of the time and effort put into this class, the petition said. The students criticized Dr. Jones' decision to reduce the number of midterm exams from 3 to 2, flattening their chances to compensate for lower grades. Yeah, sometimes it is scary when there's only 1 or 2 big exams, and that basically determines a large proportion of your overall grade. They said that he tried to conceal course averages, did not offer extra credit, and removed Zoom access to his lectures, even though some students had COVID. That would be strange. I mean, I'm sure, I would imagine the school did an investigation, but you should definitely give students the ability to get into the lectures via Zoom. I'm guessing that's when they were back in person and he didn't want people just skipping the lecture, so he restricted it. I'm not entirely sure. And they said that he had a condescending and demanding tone. Again, that's open for interpretation. I'm sure some students react better to that type of personality or maybe don't see it as condescending and demanding, while others might. We urge you to realize, the petition said, that a class with such a high percentage of withdrawals and low grades has failed to make students' learning and well-being a priority and reflects poorly on the chemistry department as well as the institution as a whole. Dr. Jones said in an interview that he reduced the number of exams because the university scheduled the first test date after 6 classes, which was too soon. I wonder how much power the university has in determining when the exam dates can be and versus the professor, because I imagine you could have just moved the test to have 3 tests, just slightly different dates, but who knows. On the accusation that he concealed course averages, Dr. Jones said that they were impossible to provide because 25% of the grades relied on lab scores and a final lab test, but that students were otherwise aware of their grades. So I was going to say, yeah, you can just show the averages of what's been done so far. So if they were aware of the grades and like the averages of each test and what they did in comparison, then that's fine. Now, the way we did it, for example, at Cornell is, yes, the averages were sometimes very low, sometimes it was 50s or 60s, but then it was graded on a curve and you can set where that median grade is going to be. So maybe you set the median as a B minus, for example, and then people who do 1 standard deviation above the mean, so let's say the mean was a 55 or something, and the standard deviation was a 10. Students who got a 65, maybe instead of a B minus, got a B or B plus or something like that. Usually if you're like 2 standard deviations above the mean or something, you're closer to that A range. That's how a lot of schools do it. I'm not exactly sure how they did it here, but I have to imagine that they were still giving out some A's and B's. As for the Zoom access, he said the technology in the lecture hall made it impossible to record his whiteboard problems. So, I mean, this might be true, but NYU has a lot of money. So I do think more and more schools are making it where classes can be recorded, and I think it would be good to have some sort of camera or something set up where students can access the recordings, especially if you're going to charge the same tuition when classes were all online. When classes are back in person, I personally think you should give people the option to watch recordings or Zoom into the class, and I'm sure they could figure out the technology to make that happen. All right, I'm just going to skip down a little bit. Someone said, this is a big lecture course, and it also has a reputation of being a weed out class, said Mr. Zhu, who has transferred and is now a junior at Brown. So there are people who will not get the best grades. Some of the comments might have been very heavily influenced by what grade students have gotten. Yeah, I'm sure the students that got A's are not really complaining, to be honest. Again, it feels like your life is ending, but that's not necessarily the case just because you're getting 1 bad grade in Orgo. So moving on, as you can see, it says, Dr. Jones learned to teach during a time when the goal was to teach at a very high and rigorous level, Dr. Roa said. We hope that students will see that putting them through that rigor is doing them good. Yeah, so I mean, it depends. Like, you should teach to a level that is pushing your students to do better, but if it's so far beyond where they're at, and a lot of students don't come in with much background of organic chemistry, then it could be at a detriment to the student, in my opinion. Now, I'm sure he's not changed. I don't really think it sounds like he's done anything out of malice, but the pressure to get into medical school and this overall process, it can really beat down on students, and the truth is, a lot of students do like to complain. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it does happen. I don't think someone should get fired over that, but there could be measures put in place, for example, making sure that, let's say, the median or the mean of the class is set to a certain bar. That might already be the case. So if it's a B or B plus, then people that are doing better than the mean, let's say even if it's a 60, people that are getting 75s are likely getting A's, and then it's not going to hurt their overall chances of getting into medical school. Not that it's going to be the biggest deal at the end of the day anyway, because it's just 1 class. However, what I also will say about organic chemistry is that sometimes classes in organic chemistry at some of these institutions go well beyond what you would need for the MCAT exam, which is the the test that you need to take to get into medical school. So sometimes you are learning way more than the basics, and some of these professors like to teach it like they're teaching PhD chemistry, or someone who's going to get an organic chemistry PhD themselves, which is not really what you need to know as a future med student. You just need to know the basics, the SN1, SN2 reactions, things like that, different classifications. I mean, yes, make it challenging, but it doesn't need to be the hardest class in the world. That's just my opinion. Overall, I think that there could have been measures taken to just adjust the grading. And I think even if the class is really hard, then students wouldn't care as much. I also think that there should be some sort of standards set in place. I don't think it should be too easy, because you do need to be willing to put in work and work hard to get good grades, because the road to becoming a doctor is definitely a challenging one. And being the person that is always complaining is not going to serve you well in the long run. There are exceptions, and if it truly there's something unjust happening, then obviously you want to speak up. I don't know if I see enough evidence here of that, and I think that changes could be made before letting the professor go in its entirety. But I'm curious to hear, what do you think about this whole dilemma? The orgo professor versus the scared and nervous pre-med students who are not doing as well. I think that there's probably good points on both sides. Hopefully a compromise could have been met. It doesn't seem like that was necessarily the case here, but there's a lot to learn from this example. And if you are one of those students who feels like you never know how to do well in class, and you are relying on the professor, because you should not be relying only on the professor to do well, and you want pre-med coaching and guidance through the whole process that includes MCAT prep and admissions, then click the link below and you could schedule a call with me and my team, and we will see how we can help you through this process, and we'll also send you some free training.